First of all, my apologies for not being able to be with you in person. Many thanks for the conference organizer for giving me this opportunity to share with you on my research, a unique geospatial perspective on sustainable urban mobility in the big data era. I'm saying this perspective is unique because it is very different from the mainstream GIS. The current GIS is very much geometric and mechanistic. Before presenting this geospatial perspective on sustainable urban mobility, I have a couple of things to clarify. The first is about the home-taking message of this presentation. The former British Prime Minister had this very famous statement about the relationship between our buildings and our behavior. We shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us. Our travel, behavior, our activities, or even our happiness. To rephrase Churchill in the context of the transport, we shape our transport system, it will shape our travel. So make sure we shape it well, so we will be well shaped too. To be more specific, we shape our transport system as a living structure, and afterwards it shapes our sustainable urban mobility. The second thing is, what do I mean by sustainable? I put sustainable the same as several others, such as smart, life, and beautiful. All these words sound pretty subjective, being personal preference or a matter of opinion. Yet they are essentially objective or being structural, and can be measured or quantified. They will be used interchangeably in this presentation and are closely related to the notion of living structure. The living structure is a sustainable structure not only in terms of how it looks, the form, the shape, but also in terms of how it works, the underlying functions. For example, the circulatory system is a living structure and it is sustainable for thousands of years during the span of our life. In fact, it is sustainable forever because this living structure maintains generation by generation. The living structure is not only biological or exists in nature, but in what we make or build. This building is a living structure and it can sustain for hundreds of years and even for a big earthquake. There is little doubt that the living structure has a nice looking, being living, beautiful, but also in terms of the underlying functions, how it works. The geospatial perspective I'm going to share is capable of revealing the living structure of geographical space or our surroundings, rooms, buildings, gardens, cities, and even beyond towards countries and the global. As I said, the geospatial perspective I'm going to share differs fundamentally from the existing GIS, which is very much geometric and very much mechanistic. As shown in the GIS representations of vector and raster, space is conceived as a collection of geometric primitives of points, lines, polygons, or pixels. Or a space is mechanistically partitioned into many geometric primitives. The geospatial perspective I'm going to present is less geometric and less mechanistic. It is called the topological and scaling perspective. Taking this very simple street network, for example, this is a very common GIS representation with geometric details such as locations, distances, and directions. In this animation, we can see individual junctions or street segments get interconnected and graph. Now we would like to transform this geometric representation into a topological one, made of individual streets. For example, the longest main street, the two major streets in the middle, and many other shorter ones. Clearly, there are far more shorter streets than long ones, or there are far more less connected streets than the well-connected ones. This is the topological and scaling perspective I would like to share and discuss with you. Here is the structure of my presentation. I will first make it clear the topology among meaningful geographic features. By the meaningful geographic features, I meant cities, buildings, streets, and lakes, just to mention a few examples. The topology that I defined in this way, or the topology among meaningful geographic features, enable us to see the underlying scaling or living structure of far more smalls than larges. Then I will introduce head-tail bricks, a new classification scheme for showing scaling or living structure, and more importantly, the underlying way of thinking, so-called the head-tail bricks thinking. The living structure of geographic space can be reviewed through two concepts, nature cities and nature streets, at both country and city levels. X-Warming is a software tool for examining how living a structure is. In this regard, I will show many examples of nature cities and nature streets from Greece and other countries. Before summarizing my major points, I will show a very simple example about the living structure. As mentioned earlier, existing GIS is not only too geometric, but also too mechanistic. The topology as conceived and defined in the current GIS is imposed mechanistically among geometric primitives of points, lines, polygons, and pixels. The concept of topology is very well studied in GIS, for example, in Max Egenhofer's topological model, in which a set of topological relationships are defined, such as touch, meet, and disjoint. The concept of topology is also appeared in the London Underground map. It is called cartogram, geometrically distorted, yet topologically maintained. The topology among the individual stations. The topology I defined differs fundamentally from that defined in current GIS. The current GIS representations are not only geometric, but also mechanistic. Instead, the topology among the meaningful geographic features is organic, through which we can see far more smalls than larges, or far more less connected than the well-connected. Or put in a different way, numerous least connected, showing blue, a very few most connected, showing red, and some in between the least and the most connected, showing other colors. In the next few slides, I'm going to begin with a human face, how the living structure of far more smalls than larges is pervasively or ubiquitously seen on different scales. A human face is a scaling or living structure due to which there are far more attentions on very few landmarks, the eyes, the nose, and the mouth, or 90% of attentions are on the 10% of space of human face, as shown in these eye-tracking fixation points. A human body is a scaling or living structure. This kind of living structure recurs at different levels of skill in the brain, in the heart, in the lung, in neural systems, and in many other parts of the human body. Here is just an example of the circulatory system. A society is a scaling or living structure in which there are far more poor people than rich people. There are far more ordinary people than extraordinary people. I hope you can see the extraordinary one who is addressing the crowds. A city is a scaling or living structure in which there are far more short streets than long ones, or far more less connected streets than well-connected ones. The least connected are represented by blue. The most connected is represented by red. And more importantly, some in between the least and the most connected, represented by other colors. Again, a city is a scaling or living structure in which there are far more low buildings than high buildings. To be more precise, numerous lowest buildings, a very few highest buildings, and some in between the lowest and the highest. Human activities in a city demonstrate the scaling or living structure. It implies that 90% of human activities concentrate only on the 10% of space. In other words, in the 90% of space, there are only 10% of human activities, whereas in the 10% of space, there are 90% of human activities. This is a map showing geolocation of flick photo in Manhattan, New York. Now let's get out of the city scale to the country scale. There are far more small cities than larger ones. This city size distribution is commonly known as Zipf's law. The largest city is twice as big as the second largest, 3 times as big as third largest, 4 times as big as fourth largest, and so on and so forth. At the global scale, the Earth's surface is occupied by far more ocean than land. It is 70 by 30 partition rather than 50 by 50 partition. In the galaxy, there are far more small stars than larger ones. Given the pervasiveness of the living structure, I formulated scaling law out of this notion of far more smalls than larges. Importantly, the notion or the scaling of far more smalls than larges occurs not just once, but multiple times. In other words, far more smalls than larges occurs at different levels of scale. Scaling law, or the notion of far more smalls than larges, is in contrast to turbulence law, or the notion of more is similar. Back to 1970s, Professor Walter Turbuley formulated what is commonly known as the first law of geography. Everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. In other words, nearby things tend to be more similar or related. The price of your house is similar to those of your neighbors. Today's weather is more similar to yesterday's than the day before yesterday's. Scaling law and turbulence law complement each other for characterizing the Earth's surface or living structure in general. These two laws are basic laws about the two spatial properties, spatial heterogeneity and spatial dependency. Scaling law is about the interdependency, while the turbulence law about the dependency. It is important to note the difference between interdependency and dependency. Dependency implies dependency at a local scale. For example, my housing price depends on my neighbors. However, interdependency implies recurring dependency at a global scale, and again endlessly. Let me use the fish tank story to tell the difference. If you bought 100 pieces of the golden fish, all with the same size at the beginning, if one day one fish eats a bit more and gets a little bit big, as time goes, there would be the effect of rich get rich, poor get poor. Among the 100 fish, there would be many small fish, while a very few larger ones in the end. The result of far more small fish than larger ones comes from the interdependency effect through the interaction, trading, and the competition. So scaling law is available across all scales, ranging from the smallest to the largest. Scaling is also called scale-free, or long-tailed, or heavy-tailed. It indicates disproportion, 80 by 20, rather than proportion, 50 by 50. Scaling law implies complexity or non-equilibrium rather than simplicity or equilibrium. To further illustrate these two laws, or the notions of far more small than largest and the more is similar, let's look at the 10 numbers experiment. There are two sets of 10 numbers. The first is 1, 2, 3, and up to 10, which is linear, proportional, and with the more is similar. The other follows Zipf's law. The first is 1, second is a half, and the third is 1/3, and 10th is 1/10. The second set of 10 numbers indicate nonlinear, disproportional, and with far more smalls and largest. Taking the second 10 numbers, for example, the average of these 10 numbers is 0.29, which divides the 10 numbers into two parts. Those smaller than the average, called the tail. There are 7 numbers shown in blue. And those bigger than the average, called the head. The first 3 numbers, 1, half, and the 1/3. For the 3 in the head, the average of them is 0.61, which further divides the 3 into two parts. Those smaller than the average, called the tail. There are 2 in the tail, showing yellow, and 1 in the head, showing orange. The recursive processing of dividing the numbers into many small and very few large is called head-tail bricks, a new classification scheme for data with a heavy-tail distribution. This is the new classification method I developed a few years ago. Formally, head-tail bricks is defined as a recursive function, and the division between the head and the tail recursively continues until the condition of small head and long tail is violated, for example, the head being less than 40%. Unlike many conventional classification methods, head-tail bricks is for data with a heavy-tail distribution or long-tail distribution. The head-tail bricks leads to an important index, so-called HT index, which can be used to characterize the degree of scaling or leaving structure. The higher the HT index, the more scaling or leaving the structure is. One can go to the head-tail bricks Wikipedia for more details about the related research. For example, head-tail bricks is not only a classification scheme, but also a visualization tool for big data. To this point, I would like to stress that head-tail bricks is not just a technique for classification and visualization, but more importantly, a new way of thinking, the head-tail bricks thinking. In the 21st century, our society is becoming more and more dominated by two parallel forces rather than one single force, in the past centuries. Phone industry was dominated by national telecom, but now we have Skype. Botanic dominated the market for a very long time, but now we have Wikipedia. National Map Agency is used to dominate the geospatial industry, but now we have OpenStreetMap, a free editable map of the entire world, or a wiki-like corporation for geospatial information. Information was controlled by governments or mass media giants such as CNN, but now we have social media and WikiLeaks. These two forces indicate two different ways of thinking. One is centralized, top-down, the other decentralized, bottom-up. These two ways of thinking reflect very much in the USA election back to 2009, when Democratic primaries, she and he compete for the presidential candidate. On the head, she was the first lady attached to the Washington, D.C., very well known, while on the tail, he was just a young senate. Not many people know him. However, eventually, he won not only the presidential primaries, but also the White House. His victory is a victory of the head-tail bricks thinking, the victory of the long tail. She relied on a very few rich people or very few extraordinary for her campaign funds, while he relied on many ordinary people who donate $5, $10. White House is for a white couple or white family, but one day a black couple came, history was made. After 8 years, she came back again. Unfortunately, she did not learn from her mistake, and she shouldn't have changed her name from Hillary to Tillery, or changed the campaign logo from H to T. The USA election 2016 sets another very good example for the head-tail bricks thinking. The two parallel forces, the head and the tail, are dominating our society, so we should not take the head for the default. The victory of Trump surprised many who are used to think of the head for the default. Seen from this map, this is indeed a divided states of America. But remember, this is the victory of long tail, or the victory of the head-tail bricks thinking. This is also what the power of head-tail bricks thinking lies on. To this point, I would like to pose a question for you. In this map, which color, red or blue, shows the head? Or which color, red or blue, shows the tail? Think about it, and I will give you your answer by the end of this presentation. Now let's go back to the scaling or living structure, which is pervasively seen in cities at different levels of scale. A city not only looks as a living structure, but also works as a living entity like a human brain. The evolution of Amsterdam before the 20th century looks very much like a living entity, not only in terms of how it looks, the morphology, or the structure, but also in terms of how it works or evolves. In other words, both looks and works are governed by scaling law and turbulence law. The historic city Rome is a living structure. The same for Venice as a living structure. Now, to see the living structure, we must adopt the topological perspective. Here we see how this tiny ornament is represented topologically in order to see the underlying living structure of far more smalls than larges. Here we see how the street network is topologically represented in order to see the underlying living structure of far more less connected than the well connected. In other words, many, the least connected by blue, and very few, the most connected by the red, and some in between the least and the most connected. Now it is time to look at the nature cities, a new concept defined from the bottom up using heritage bricks and geospatial big data. Given a set of geolocation, for example, freak photo locations, we build up a huge triangulated irregular network, so-called TIN. Clearly, the TIN edges demonstrate a long-tail distribution, implying that there are far more short edges than long ones. We applied heritage bricks into the set of edges and divided them into two parts, short edges and long edges. Those short edges, or high-density edges, constitute what we call nature cities, indicated by the red patches. Using tweet locations of the entire world, we derived nature cities for the globe. Here is some snapshots showing how nature cities around Chicago and New York evolve. Clearly, they become more and more fragmented, with far more small pieces than larger ones. The evolution of the nature cities is put in comparison with the Koch snowflake. From the comparison, we can understand why geographic processes are essentially fractal rather than Euclidean. This is the third time we show this figure. This time, I would like to stress how nature streets are generated from individual street segments, and how nature streets are in line with our spatial cognition. We perceive the network made of streets as individual coherent wholes, rather than geometrical primitives of locations and line segments, and more importantly, the living structure of far more less connected streets than the well-connected ones. XWoman is a software tool for conduct the topological and scaling analysis of geospatial big data based on the geospatial perspective I'm talking about. It is a freeware based on ArcGIS and has been widely used for better understanding open structure and dynamics. In this website, there is also a set of tutorials on how to conduct the kind of analysis using, for example, the OpenStreetMap data. Here, I would like to pose a second question for you. Do you know why it is called XWoman? This is an example of city of Taipei from Taiwan before and after the topological and scaling analysis. Clearly, the underlying scaling or living structure is shown after the analysis, but hidden before the analysis. The same for the case of the Stockholm, the capital of the Sweden. Now let's turn to Greece. Using OpenStreetMap street nodes of over 1 million, we derive over 4,000 nature streets across the country. The red patches are these nature cities. From over 1.6 million street segments, we derived 530,000 nature streets in the country. Now let's zoom in to the city level. This spectral coloring showing the living structure of far more less connected streets than the well-connected ones. It was found that 90% of traffic occurs at the top 10% of streets. This is what we call street hierarchy. Here is a few more examples of living city from this country. Having talking about so much about the living structure, what is a living structure? The living structure is a recursive structure defined mathematically, and it exists in space and matter physically. Taking two papers, for example, one with a tiny dot in the middle, the other a blank paper. The paper with a tiny dot in the middle can induce about 20 centers. For example, a little circle surrounding the tiny dot. The space is partitioned into 4 pieces: the left, the right, the up, and the bottom. There is also a cross-like thing, 4 corners, 4 rays between the 4 corners and the tiny dot. Importantly, the 20 induced centers form a very convoluted supporting relationship for the coherent whole. Eventually, the coherent whole constitutes a living structure in which there are far more low intensities than high intensities. The living structure has a very steep scaling hierarchy. On the other hand, the black paper has a very flat scaling hierarchy. This is the major difference between the living and dead structures. Now it is time to wrap up my major points. Unlike the existing GIS perspective, the geospatial perspective I'm presenting is both topological and living, so it is less geometric and less mechanistic. The unique geospatial perspective enables us to see the underlying living structure that substantially shapes urban mobility. The living structure is governed by 2 fundamental laws, scaling law and turbulence law. X-woman is a powerful diagnosis tool for measuring living structure, but we are currently developing towards a design tool for smart city or smart urban mobility. Finally, a city is a living structure and is made neither of traffic zones nor of OD, but of individual coherent streets. Thank you very much for your attention. I have enjoyed this presentation. If you have any questions and comments, please feel free to contact me via my email bin.jiang@hig.se. Here is my answer to the 2 questions I posed earlier. The first, what color shows the head, what color shows the tail in the presidential election map 2016. The blue shows the head, the red shows the tail. Why it is called X-woman? Because there's another software called X-men based on the Macintosh computer, but X-woman is a plug-in to the ArcGIS software.